All right, sit down and buckle up because it's the time of the week for the Global Bob Show. The Global Bob Show, we are the crossroad of technology and politics. I would like to thank everybody who tunes in each week to the Global Bob Show, and special kudos and thumbs up to those that spread the word about the show. That's the reason why I do this each week, is to try to impart a little bit of knowledge in very simple ways so you can understand the advanced technologies and also the political and legal ramifications around them. So Web 3.0, before we dive into that, we need to talk about how did we even get to Web 1.0? Right now, we're in Web 2.0. So let's back up a little bit. Now, when you think of the internet, first thing that comes to mind is communications. That's why it's really no surprise when you think about the person that really envisioned the internet, and that was Nikola Tesla. Now, not the guy that invented the Tesla. That's old Elon Musk, who's doing a wonderful job. But this is Nikola Tesla, and so those that have been in the radio industry and know about radios, he's really the father of radio. And he envisioned a wireless system that could connect the world back in the 1900s. And then visionaries such as Paul Otlet conceived of a mechanical searchable storage system of books and other forms of media slightly after that. So we already had these visionaries that were thinking about the world being connected, and then the next visionary thinking about how we could have a system of books and other media that's searchable. Now, fast forward just a little bit, we have Linklander, and in the 60s, he talked with his colleagues of an intergalactic network of computers. So that's really cool that before the internet was actually really invented, these folks were already talking about it. They didn't maybe know what it is, but at least they were talking about it. Well, it wouldn't come into the late 1960s where ARPANET. Now, ARPANET stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. Reason why we need to mention them is because, one, that's where the internet as we know it today formed out of. But they started to use packet switches that allowed for multiple computers to get connected together. Before ARPANET, computers, if you wanted to access them, you would have to go to the room that they were in, kind of like these mainframes that some of y'all remember from the older days. But one mainframe could talk to another mainframe, but it wasn't like connected as we know it today. So the reason why that's really important is because the internet works off of a packet switched network. Now, at some of your houses or your offices, you may have a switch. So you have a router, and then you may also have a switch where you have a bunch of things plugged into it. Well, that's simply a switch, of which the ARPA were the first ones to start using that switch network. The reason why that's really important is that now we could have multiple computers connected to a wire. In the very, very early days, this was actually coax. So when ARPANET was first conceived, they would actually use coax, and they would run it through from computer to computer, much like your TV coax. And then at the end, whoever was the last computer on the line, they would put a terminator on there. And what's really neat, if they needed to hook up another computer without taking the network down, they wouldn't splice, right? Like cut the cable, because that would take the network down. They use something called vampire taps, which is kind of a cool name. The vampire tap, you could clip it onto the coax cable and then screw the screw through, and it would have connectivity, which was really neat. But as you know, that didn't scale. Going further, we will know that the Ethernet would be used, and that's the protocol that we use today, right, with Cat 5, Cat 6. So the foundation of the internet from the 1960s, really, that switch had to be invented to get us to where we're at today. Now, a lot of people know that, and if you've listened to my previous podcast about your IP address, well, that's called TCP/IP. A lot of times people use those interchangeably, but you can have other protocols other than TCP. So think of TCP as the language that's being spoken, and the IP portion of it is how the data gets delivered. So your IP address is the IP part of that. We mentioned you can have public IPs and private IPs. However, I digress. TCP/IP came out in 1983. Once again, our friends at ARPANET are the ones that adopted it. And that's really what allowed for these computers to be addressable on a network as they are today. So when one computer needed to talk to another computer, they would just type in the IP address. Now, you know, IP address consists of a long number. Probably at your home network, your IP address is in the 192.168.0.0/24 range. So at your house, if you wanted to talk from, say, your laptop computer to your printer, you would just get the IP address of your printer. Now, you probably would forget the IP address by the time you walked back to your computer of the printer. So you would need to write it down. And this is the same thing that happened in the early 80s. If one computer on one side of the world needed to talk to another computer, well, they would need to get the IP address. So that really would hinder the way that they communicate, right? Because, I mean, now you're having to keep track of all these IP addresses and you're having to write them down or whatever you do to understand what they are. Knowing this, then what we had to do was figure out an easier way to translate that IP address into something that was more easy to understand. So the domain name system had to be invented. And this was around 1985. So in 1983, ARPA adopts the TCP/IP way of communicating between various networks and computers. So within a few years, this tells you how important this was, that someone invented the domain name system. And the very first domain that was ever registered was March 15th, 1985. And the name of that system was called Symbolics.com. Apparently, there was an IP address for Symbolics.com, and Symbolics wanted an easier way to get to that IP. So they registered Symbolics.com. And that's all DNS is. It's a way to have a word or letters associated with an IP address. Now, it wouldn't be until 1986 when some famous folks like Xerox registered their domain name, Xerox.com. And also, there were other ones that followed suit, Northrop. So you see that these internet folks that were early adopters, they were major corporations, or in the case of Northrop, government contractors. And that's essentially what Internet 1.0 was. It was largely used for government contractors, universities, some high-end medical facilities, or I should say cutting-edge medical facilities. That's what they used. It was Internet 1.0. Now, for consumers such as myself, the normal people, we used things like Delphi, AOL towards the end, Prodigy, CompuServe. That's when these companies started to emerge. Now, when you go to a normal website, you open up your web browser and you go to www www.globalbobshow.com, well, you're using what they call the Hypertext Transport Protocol. Now, that wasn't invented yet with Internet 1.0. It will come into that at the end, and that's what will launch us into 2.0. But for all intent and purposes, you were using these providers to give you an on-ramp into the internet. And once connected, it was very much a read-only network. What I mean by that is that you would go to a site using something like Gopher or FTP or Telnet. All these are all textual-based file transfers or text-based type reading, but you would go to, say, NASDAQ. And NASDAQ would give you the news and the stock ticker symbols and other information, but you didn't really interact with it. You couldn't leave comments, like if you went to a news site like Reuters. You couldn't leave comments. You didn't log into sites. And so it was kind of like a billboard type system, right? Like you're driving down the road and you see a billboard and you read what's on the billboard, but you can't interact with the billboard. That was Web 1.0. So keep in mind, the web browser, as we know it today, had not been invented yet. One of the first web browsers I remember interacting with was something called Mosaic. And I don't know if you would actually consider Mosaic to be the first web browser, but that was one that had images, very rudimentary type graphics. And also, you have to remember at this time, Google was not invented. So when you go to Google and you type in something and it brings back all the links to the pages, that wasn't invented. Whenever I would use Mosaic in this Web 1.0-ish into 2.0 time frame, I actually had a book, and I wish I could find that book. But it was like a phone book for the internet. It would list IP addresses for different resources. It would list domain names for them as well. So if you wanted to, say, look up stocks, you would flip to the S's, go down through the book. I think I got it at like Walden's bookstore or something like that in the Winter Haven Mall. But you would find the IP address or you would find the domain name and you would type that into Mosaic and poof, the site would load. Now that was Web 1.0 and that roughly spanned the time from 1991 to around 2004. So even though we were in Web 1.0, there was the major thing that was invented that really just kind of set the internet on fire. And that is HTTP, or Hypertext Transport Protocol. Now remember I said Internet 1.0 roughly ran to 2004, but it was in 1996 at the tail end of 1.0 that HTTP was invented and being adopted, and that's where really we launched into this 2.0 realm. So all the building blocks are there as we know the internet today. We can go to a domain name that gets translated to an IP address. HTTP has been invented. More folks at their house are starting to have home computers. All of this interconnectivity is going on, but there was an appetite for not going to see the billboard and get the information that's being received, but an appetite for us to be able to interact with the internet. And that's where we see things like Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, name your sites where you could actually go there and you could post content and create content on the internet. So in Web 1.0, you would authenticate with your provider. You would call in to a phone number and you would hear the crazy modem go back and forth. and then you would be on the internet. With Web 2.0, once you authenticated with your provider, still with 2.0, a lot of it was dial-up because the home connected broadband wouldn't come into, a few years later after maybe 2002-ish. I'm trying to think of when I got my first broadband connection. But you would authenticate, and then if you went to another site, you would authenticate. Much like today, when someone comes to your house, they get on the Wi-Fi, they ask you for your Wi-Fi password, but then they use their own username and password to get into, say, Facebook and Twitter and the bank. Now, here's two problems that I want to bring up. So if you don't want somebody communicating in Web 1.0, your provider could turn you off. So you would dial up and they wouldn't accept your phone call. Back in those days, they could actually call block your number. If you dialed into a BBS and you created some havoc, they could just block you. With Web 2.0, you're on the internet, but if you cause some kind of mayhem, say on Facebook and Twitter, or you say something that's outside of their policies, then they can block you from their servers and that portion of the internet. So when you think about Internet 1.0, I say that's read-only. Internet 2.0 to the user is read and write. I can post on Facebook, I can post on Twitter, I can read on Facebook, I can read on Twitter, back and forth. Now it's time for the next iteration of the internet, and that is Internet 3.0. I've given you some main themes around Internet 1.0, 2.0, but let's think about the main theme of Web 3.0, and that is decentralization. It's kind of a big word, but when you think about decentralization and content ownership, that's what I want you to think about when you hear Web 3.0. That means if I post something on Facebook, Facebook is not the owner of that image. I'm still the owner of that image, and I can prove ownership of that image. And on Facebook, even if I delete something on Facebook, Facebook still could have a copy of that. Well, with Web 3.0, there's things in place that make sure that you maintain ownership. Now, we're going to really dive into 3.0, and the main thing I want you to know is that it's not defined yet. There's a lot to 3.0, but the main theme of it is ownership, meaning you as the creator. Because if you've ever posted anything on YouTube or Facebook, technically you're a creator, but you maintain ownership of that creation. And that just does not include images or posts. That also includes things like your medical records and your personal data that gets out on the internet. Now, the last episode I talked about digital exhaust and how data brokers make a lot of money from your digital exhaust. With Web 3.0, you own that data, so you can restrict or you can give that data to whomever you want. Now, before we get too deep into this, this particular episode topic was submitted by a friend of mine named Roberto. Now, Roberto is a very smart guy, and he asked me to create a podcast for Web 3.0. And whenever I thought about it, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to explain this to my mom? Since that's the way I tend to format these podcasts, is that at the end of the podcast, I like to call my mom and ask her what she learned from it. And so when he asked me about that, I immediately discounted it. I was thinking to myself, oh my God, how am I going to tell my mom about Web 3.0? But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that there are a lot of real world examples. So please, If you're listening to this for a deep dive in the technical end of 3.0, then give me a call or an email and we'll have a Zoom meeting and we will go even deeper. So I just want to kind of put that disclaimer out. I'm trying to explain this in such a way that even my mom can understand. All right, so back to 3.0. Now, when you get onto Facebook and you get onto Twitter and you have an issue and it says that you have been banned for a certain amount of days, that is because all of your data is centrally located on their servers. Just like in 1.0, where the person that's providing you the on-ramp could block your phone number, with 2.0, when you submit, that data is living on their server, completely controlled by them. Well, with 3.0, your data is distributed across many, many nodes or computers. So that means there's many copies of that distributed around the internet, and therefore it cannot be blocked because there's not a central place for that block to happen, right? So when you submit a post or a picture to, say, Facebook or Twitter, that picture could be stored anywhere on any nodes that are participating in this Web 3.0 ecosystem. And to really think about this, you have to understand that the interface into Facebook or Twitter is via their application. You really can't access Facebook or Twitter without using the app on your phone. Sure, you can go to the website, but even then, that's just another interface itself. But think about a world where you post to this metaverse and it's just out there, right? I write one post that says, "I love the Global Bob Show and all my listeners." But that can be syndicated on Twitter and Facebook and Odyssey and all the other sites. One post goes to many. Moreover, when you access that, you can access it through many, many applications. So that is another way of decentralization. Let's say I come up with a social media platform and I want everybody to start using it. And so I create an application for Android and iOS. We'll call it the Global Bob Show app. And I have my own servers. Well, still, there's a central authority that can take me offline. There's a few ways, actually. One, Google Play Store and iTunes can take my app off there, right? So now you can't get it other than going to a website or using a web browser. That's very cumbersome, especially in the day that we live in, right? And a lot of people don't have laptops at home anymore or a computer in the kitchen. Most of us, just like me recording this podcast, I'm using my iPad or iPhone. So if Apple or Google doesn't agree with my principles or the information I'm putting out, they can take it off. Well, with Web 3.0, you can have many, many applications that can access that. And one of the popular ones is called Mastodon. Now, when there was a lot going on during the presidential election, and there were some of the major platforms, we heard them being called deplatformed. Once you're deplatformed, you're kind of done, right? If you're making YouTube videos and YouTube kicks you off, you're done. Well, if you have your own, say, network and you have your own application, well, Apple or Google can say, you're done, right? They take your application out of the Play Store or the iOS store, App Store, you're done. With Web 3.0, you can have many applications that access it. And that's what's really important, is to understand that there's not a central authority that can turn you off. And if they did, then there are other on-ramps into your content. Now, there's a lot of other things around 3.0, so that's just one of them, right? The ownership of content, you're the creator, you own it. But when you move into a realm of, say, medical records, you don't know. You go from one doctor to the other. Has your medical records been deleted? Where have they shared your medical records with? And with 3.0, you will have ownership and you can revoke the sharing of those records. That's just another example. Another example of Web 3.0 is this whole fusion between the physical and metaphysical world. Where we've operated since the dawn of time is in a physical world. We've all heard it before, seeing's believing. Well, as we move into 3.0, you have the physical layer, then you have this digital layer, and then the combination of two will be this augmented reality layer. We've already seen a lot of this in gaming, right? You put the goggles on and you're playing your first person shooter game, and that is being completely emerged into the digital layer. But rewind a little bit. I know whenever I was younger, my little brother, he loved Pokemon. He had tons of Pokemon cards. He would go and play Pokemon with the kids at school, and they would trade cards, and it was pretty cool. Well, one of the first augmented reality type experiences that I had was with something called Pokemon Go. Or if I really wanted to call myself a nerd, it was the inverse program. But anyways, Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, we had kids running around with their cell phones trying to find Pikachu, but yet getting in trouble for trespassing. Well, Pokemon Go would take your physical world and overlay an augmented reality to play a game. I live pretty close to Legoland, and I remember reading in the newspaper where some kids got in trouble because the Pokemon Go augmented reality app was saying that there was some Pokemon thing on the other side of the fence. And so these kids actually went into Legoland to go get that reward, which was really kind of interesting to think about. So were they really trespassing? Well, in the physical world they were, but in the metaphysical world, I guess they were not. Now, that's all fun and games and more gamer type things. But when you think about the metaphysical world, when you're fusing physical world with the digital world, I could envision, say, my cousin who's a dermatologist. He gets calls at various hours and he has to bring up the patient records and he may be driving down the road. Well, with Web 3.0 and augmented reality, there's a time coming where he could put on his glasses, he can continue to drive down the road, but yet he sees the patient records transposed and he can read them and maybe diagnose somebody as he's going to his favorite spot. So you see in manufacturing and medical, where I like to say the business end of all this high-tech science fiction that's turning into science fact, I am envisioning a world that is coming quickly upon us where you can go to, say, your doctor or my cousin, the dermatologist, and instead of filling out all that rudimentary paperwork, right? They hand you the paperwork and it asks you questions like height, age, weight. If you're pregnant, even if you're a male, you got to answer yes or no. And your medical records will just go with you. And if you leave his practice, you can revoke access to your medical records. If he needs to share your medical records with somebody else, you will have the authority to share that or not. He puts his glasses on, you put your glasses on, if you guys are remote or ladies are remote, and he can have you look over your body and he is seeing exactly what he needs to see. And then with artificial intelligence and augmented realities. Maybe they can spot cancerous spots. And so when I think about Web 3.0, I am very excited for the possibilities for health and humanity. And then the last part of Web 3.0 is having a digital currency. A few podcasts back, we talked about Bitcoin and other coins. And so maybe you could pay him in Bitcoin. Now, I really like the digital currency part just because I've traveled all over the world. And digital currency is very much, by the way, part of Web 3.0. I've traveled all over the world, and one of the things I hate is the currency conversion. Well, as we emerge into Web 3.0, that currency conversion really doesn't need to happen, because if you understand what one BTC is, which is short for Bitcoin, and you go see my cousin, the dermatologist, who's in Florida, and he charges you, for simple terms, a half a BTC for his services, but you find somebody else in another country who can review you virtually and they charge, let's say, a half a BTC, well, you don't need to do the currency conversion, right? So in that case, you would have to convert US dollars to, say, pesos, real, pound sterling. With Web 3.0, not only are we going to get the privacy, we're also going to get the global currency, and I'm really excited for these times. Now, the last thing I got to leave you with is the other side of the equation. We're all hyped up on Web 3.0. I know I am. I'm looking for all the positive attributes of Web 3.0. It's going to be amazing, and we're starting to get there. We already have Bitcoin. We already have technologies like Odyssey, which replaces YouTube. We have IPFS that replaces things like Dropbox and Google Docs for distribution of data. We have Mastodon that replaces Facebook. And I really shouldn't say replace, but it's a Web 3.0 version of the technology. But what happens when things get onto Web 3.0 that we may not want on 3.0? Case in point, everybody's so excited that Elon Musk is buying Twitter or has bought Twitter because he promises to have it as an open platform where people can say what they want to say and they're not going to be blocked. But then again, that's the centralization. It's him having to buy Twitter to instate his policy. But with Web 3.0, remember, people can create things, they can put it into the 3.0 or the metaverse, and there's not a central authority. So how do we deal with things that should not be on there? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is a picture that's taken of me or somebody else in a compromising position. We've seen it with revenge porn, right? Two people break up and the other person uploads some nasty pictures somewhere, or God forbid, child porn. So that's the thing I want you to think about as we are champions of privacy and security and non-central authoritative figures. We need to think, well, what happens if this content makes its way out there? And so what I think you're going to see is that the content will make its way out there, but then us, because we can define what data we share, we can define what data we consume. So maybe companies will pop up that says, hey, this is the safe Web 3.0. You pay us to ensure that that type of information does not make its way down to you. All right, well, I think we're up to time. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for staying tuned in for the length of this podcast. I know this was very technical, but if you've listened to my other podcast in the past, you can probably follow along and understand. So embrace Web 3.0, and I will see you here next week. As always, you can submit your topics that you want me to cover to globalbobshow@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook group called Global Bob Show. You can reach out to me on Twitter @GlobalBobShow. So with that, I'll say be safe as you cruise the highways and byways of cyberspace, and I will see you here this time next week.